Lewis Hamilton showed up early this morning at Ferrari's technical facility in Maranello. It wasn't just another routine visit. There was a certain weight in the air, a kind of invisible pressure hanging over the building like a low, heavy cloud. The atmosphere inside the factory wasn't one of quiet focus. It was the silence of tension, the kind that builds up when things aren't working and no one wants to be the first to admit it. You could sense it in the way people moved, in the blank expressions that passed between engineers, in the tight-lipped conversations echoing down the corridors. Ferrari was not in a good place, and Hamilton knew it before even stepping through the door. Since joining the Scuderia this season, the 7-time world champion has been fighting an uphill battle. The SF-25 has moments of promise, bursts of speed that suggest potential, but the performance isn't sustainable. The car behaves like a wild animal, fast but uncontrollable, capable of brilliance in one lap and disaster the next. It's not a simple issue of setup or surface-level flaws. The core of the car is flawed, and Hamilton, with his immense technical sensitivity and years of experience, feels it with every corner he takes. Today, Wednesday the 9th of April, things came to a head. Shortly after 9 a.m., Hamilton requested a closed-door meeting with team principal Fred Vasseur and Ferrari's lead engineering staff. This was no casual debrief, no friendly chat about driver comfort or tire degradation. This was a direct, detailed, no-nonsense session, a kind of internal intervention. Hamilton didn't walk in empty-handed. He came prepared with nearly 40 pages of data and analysis, assembled in collaboration with his longtime engineer Peter Bonington, now working alongside him at Ferrari after their legendary stint together at Mercedes. He connected his laptop to the projector, and the room fell silent as graphs and telemetry overlays filled the screen. Lap traces, throttle maps, comparative braking zones, every detail was presented with precision. The data focused particularly on Suzuka, a track that brutally exposes a car's weaknesses, especially in medium-speed direction changes. It was here that Hamilton's findings delivered a painful truth. The problem wasn't top speed, nor was it purely aerodynamic load. The issue was deeper, embedded in how the rear of the car behaves when transitioning between braking and acceleration. The SF-25 loses stability in those key moments. Hamilton highlighted Turn 7 at Suzuka, where traction is lost suddenly, without warning. He made it clear that it wasn't driver error, it was an issue of balance and mechanical architecture. As he walked the engineers through his findings, David Sansoni, the head of aerodynamics, tried to offer a counterpoint based on wind tunnel figures. But Hamilton wasn't having it. He interrupted gently, but firmly, and pointed out a fundamental disconnect between simulation and reality. He explained that the way air is managed beneath the floor of the car, the airflow through the Venturi tunnels and diffuser channels, is being misrepresented by the CFD tools. The car's digital model does not align with what actually happens on track, and that discrepancy is having a massive impact on stability, particularly at the rear. The problem is not theoretical. It's measurable, and he brought the proof. Hamilton went further. He demonstrated how these instabilities were compromising the flow between braking and throttle application, particularly in long corners. And while Charles Leclerc seemed to handle it better, that wasn't a sign of the car working. It was simply Leclerc compensating through a more aggressive driving style. Hamilton made it clear that such a trait was not a solution, but a warning sign. He said calmly, but with unmistakable urgency, that Ferrari needed to rethink the entire rear suspension concept. Not next month. Not during the summer break. No. The timeline had to change. Fred Vasseur listened closely. This was not the usual post-race download. This was a demand for transformation. And Hamilton wasn't asking for tweaks. He was pushing for a structural re-engineering of the car's dynamics, something that would require serious commitment, time, and most importantly, courage. For Ferrari, this moment was a crossroads. The SF-25 had revealed its character. And Hamilton, with the eyes of the world on him, was doing exactly what Ferrari brought him in to do. Not just to drive fast, but to expose weakness, demand excellence, and drag the team forward through sheer will and knowledge. The meeting ended without celebration or immediate resolution. But something had shifted. The words had been said, the data had been shown, and the challenge was now laid bare. Maranello wasn't just dealing with a temperamental car, it was dealing with the truth. And Lewis Hamilton had just delivered it, with precision, purpose, and no intention of backing down. Ferrari may have been built on legacy, but Hamilton was there to build a future. And this morning, in that dimly lit conference room, he made it clear that there was no more time to waste. He sat there, arms folded across his chest, his face carved into a silent sculpture of focus and calculation. He didn't interrupt. He didn't react. He just listened, eyes fixed on Hamilton, absorbing every word with the gravity it deserved. Because when a driver of Lewis Hamilton's caliber speaks in that kind of technical detail, there's only one reasonable course of action. You listen. You listen, and you take notes. The room knew it. Then Hamilton leaned forward, not raising his voice, but delivering a line that sliced through the air like a scalpel. He proposed using a regulatory loophole, one that allows for certain design modifications under the guise of safety. The FIA, he reminded them, permits structural adjustments if there's a demonstrable risk of instability under low-grip conditions. And then came the real punch. "I've already spoken with the Technical Performance Department in Paris," he said. "They're receptive. If we present a robust, data-driven report, they're open to considering our request." The room froze. Silence. Not out of doubt, but out of realization. Hamilton had already made contact with the FIA. He didn't wait for internal green lights. He spotted a critical issue, investigated its regulatory ramifications, found a legitimate avenue to act, and initiated the process himself. It wasn't the move of just a driver. It was the maneuver of someone operating at the level of a technical director, someone who doesn't merely react to a failing machine, but who hunts down root causes and preemptively builds solutions. For Ferrari, this was unfamiliar terrain. They weren't used to this. But then again, nothing about this season was normal. And certainly, nothing about Lewis Hamilton is. Around midday, Charles Leclerc joined the ongoing conversation. The dynamic could have shifted into competition or conflict, but it didn't. Hamilton welcomed him in, fully transparent. He handed over the same detailed dossier he had presented to the engineers. Line by line, he explained the aerodynamic issues at the rear, particularly the pressure loss across the diffuser region. He showed, using telemetry overlays, how their lines through corners had diverged due to the imbalance. Leclerc sat quietly, not feeling criticized, but seen. Understood. Validated. Because deep down, Charles knew it too. The car wasn't right. It hasn't been right. And now, finally, someone had built the case to prove it. If this works, the SF-25 is going to be a completely different machine, Leclerc finally said. It wasn't a throwaway comment. It was an endorsement, a rare public alignment between two highly competitive teammates who had chosen, for once, to fight the car rather than each other. By late afternoon, the factory had shifted into high gear. A technical transformation had been green-lit. The engineering teams began working immediately on a revised rear suspension system. It wouldn't be a full chassis overhaul. Current regulations simply wouldn't allow for that so late in the season, but they were already fabricating new components with different suspension geometries, specifically reworking the rocker arms and linkage mechanisms to better manage how the car transfers both vertical load and aerodynamic pressure in high-speed corners. Additionally, a progressive damping system was being evaluated, an idea, according to internal leaks, that had been pushed forward by Hamilton himself after cross-referencing technical documentation from his championship years at Mercedes. This wasn't just input. It was leadership in motion. Outside the factory walls, the whispers were already spreading. Italian motorsport media outlets began reporting that Ferrari was scrambling to implement technical upgrades before the Bahrain Grand Prix. Some referred to it as a Spec B version of the SF-25. Others called it a silent revolution. But what most didn't know, what none of the headlines captured, was that the true architect of this shift wasn't just the engineers in Maranello. It was the man behind the wheel. The one who hadn't come just to drive, but to rebuild from within. 4 weeks now, without fanfare or noise, Hamilton had been gathering data, comparing racing lines, isolating mechanical inconsistencies. He had quietly requested access to Ferrari's archived telemetry databases. He had worked late into the night with engineers who once collaborated with him in Brackley, without breaking any contracts, just exchanging insights, validating theories. What he was doing wasn't normal. It was methodical, old-school, visionary. It was the kind of influence reminiscent of figures like Alain Prost or Niki Lauda, drivers who were more than drivers, who stepped into the DNA of a team and rewrote it from within. People in Maranello began noticing. Conversations in the corridors had changed. No one talked about lap times anymore. They talked about Lewis, about the way he'd shaken the foundations of the team, not with noise, but with substance. The pace inside the factory became relentless. Several technical departments were now in direct coordination, fast-tracking development. The new suspension elements were being finalized at the Bologna R&D facility. Logistics teams were preparing for the parts to be shipped directly to Bahrain, arriving just in time for the start of the race weekend. The deadline was brutal. But the mood had shifted. Yes, there was still tension. But now, alongside it, there was something else. Something Ferrari hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. And Hamilton? He stayed away from the spotlight. No press appearances. No social media posts. He didn't want attention. He wanted answers. And above all, he wanted performance. Later that afternoon, he met again with Fred Vasseur. But this time, it wasn't a discussion about rear grip or suspension kinematics. It was about race strategy. If we stabilize the rear, we can rethink how we approach tire degradation, Hamilton said. That opens up the one-stop strategy, even at circuits with high thermal wear. But we have to test it properly during free practice. We can't go in blind. It wasn't a bold prediction. It was a calculation. One based on data, on logic, on hundreds of hours spent understanding every broken piece of the SF-25 puzzle. And so, as the sun set over Maranello, the factory lights remained on. The machines kept running. Somewhere in the background, new parts were being machined, new software lines were being written, and new simulations were being processed. But make no mistake, the most significant transformation happening at Ferrari wasn't in carbon fiber or titanium. It was philosophical. It was cultural. Because Hamilton hadn't just joined the team. He had changed it. Fred gave a quiet nod. Charles, standing nearby, processed everything in silence, mentally bookmarking every detail. There was no doubt anymore. The strategic blueprint for Bahrain was about to undergo a drastic overhaul. Something big was coming, and the outside world had started to sense the tremors. International media had already picked up on the subtle but significant shift within Ferrari. Over on Sky Sports, Ted Kravitz dropped a telling line during his segment, suggesting that something substantial was brewing behind the red walls of Maranello, and whatever it was, bore the fingerprints of Lewis Hamilton. In Italy, La Gazzetta dello Sport went even further. That morning's front page featured a headline that read Hamilton quake in Maranello. Across social media, the debate raged. Was the British driver seizing control of the team from within, or was he simply pulling it back from the edge of collapse? But inside Ferrari's headquarters, that debate didn't exist. Nobody cared whether Hamilton was leading or rescuing the team. What mattered was the car. It had to improve. Urgently. Because time was running out. Red Bull and McLaren were widening the gap. Even Mercedes, with a package riddled with its own inconsistencies, had built a buffer in the standings. Leclerc and Hamilton both understood that without immediate action, their championship hopes would vanish before mid-season. And so, on this critical Wednesday, April 9th, Ferrari executed a pivot, not through empty promises or cosmetic upgrades, but with concrete actions, based on data, analysis, and bold decisions. And all of it, every inch of the momentum shift, was set in motion by a driver who could have easily hidden behind a multimillion-dollar contract but instead chose to roll up his sleeves and operate like another member of the technical department. Hamilton hadn't come to play a role. He'd come to engineer a solution. And at the heart of Ferrari, he was proving it. The office where the morning meeting had taken place still bore the marks of what had transpired. Dossier pages, diagrams, telemetry charts, all remnants of Hamilton's presentation, remained scattered across the oval table. The energy in the building had shifted. Young engineers clung to their workstations, fingers flying over keyboards, running simulations with new parameters that Hamilton himself had suggested. Even the skeptics, the quiet doubters in the back rows of the technical group, had been taken aback by the sheer precision with which he had broken down the SF-25's behavior. One particular detail stunned everyone. Hamilton had conducted an in-depth breakdown of lateral oscillations during high-speed corners. Using subtle cues, vibrations from the steering wheel and feedback from the seat, he had detected a frequency anomaly that didn't appear in the standard data streams. Yet, it was compromising rear-end stability. While reviewing a specific corner from Suzuka, Vehicle Dynamics Chief Luca Cannizzaro turned to Hamilton, bewildered. "How did you even pick that up?" Hamilton didn't hesitate. "The car doesn't bite the apex cleanly. There's a slight delay in rear axle response, barely perceptible, but at turn-in, it creates understeer. And mid-corner, it flips into oversteer. That only happens when there's an undamped frequency on the rear end." He didn't need to check the screen. His memory, muscle and technical, was enough. That single vibration, overlooked by the standard simulations, suddenly became the highest priority for the entire department. One technician proposed reworking the suspension arm materials to absorb the resonance. Another suggested redesigning the upright joints with a different tolerance to soften unwanted rigidity. Meanwhile, in the simulator wing of the facility, another operation was unfolding. A Ferrari reserve driver, whose identity was being kept strictly confidential, was summoned for an extended simulator run. The virtual car was configured with experimental setups based entirely on Hamilton's suggestions. The Bahrain circuit model had been loaded into the sim environment, and the session was scheduled to last 6 hours, with variations in fuel loads and engine maps. They weren't hunting for outright lap time. What they sought was behavioral consistency, predictable traction, rear-end stability through low-speed turns, particularly turns 1 and 2 at Bahrain, where thermal degradation and abrasive asphalt had traditionally chewed up Ferrari's rear tires. The goal was simple: clean exits without rear tire destruction within 10 laps. Up until now, that had been impossible. But with the new direction, there was genuine hope. In another part of the building, Hamilton held a private meeting with Enrico Cardile. It was short, but intense. Cardile brought with him pressure maps of the car's floor from wind tunnel testing. Hamilton studied them closely, cross-referencing with his real-world sensations. Then, without hesitation, he circled 2 specific areas with a red pen. There. That's where the interference starts, between the diffuser exit and the lateral flow coming off the side pods. You won't see it in CFD, because your model assumes perfect flow. But when we get a crosswind, that assumption breaks, and so does the car's behavior between sessions. Cardile stared at the maps, silent for a long moment. Then he nodded. He couldn't argue. The inconsistencies matched the thermal spikes detected by pressure sensors in the car's central tunnel. For the first time, a driver had spotted something the software had failed to predict. This wasn't random. Hamilton's insight came from a career spent working alongside some of the brightest engineering minds in Formula One. He knew what to look for, where to find it, and how to explain it in terms that merged physics with driver feel. His vocabulary wasn't vague. He didn't say the car understeers. He told them where, under what conditions, with how much grip, and which pedal phase created the imbalance, and how it related to chassis geometry. Later, he went down to the garage to speak directly with the mechanics. No fireproofs, no logos. Just a gray sweatshirt and a black cap. But his presence needed no badges. He thanked them, asked for patience, spoke with the tone of a man not giving orders but sharing a mission. He told them the changes they were working on wouldn't be magic, but they might just be the start of something real. A reset, a recovery. And he urged them to stay locked in, to trust the process. One veteran mechanic, Italian, white-haired, sleeves rolled up, walked over and patted him gently on the shoulder. His words, barely above a whisper, said more than a press release ever could. Finally, one of them who gets his hands dirty with us. The hours stretched on in Maranello. Outside, the sun dipped beneath the hills. But inside, the factory pulsed with activity. Lights stayed on. Printers spat out load distribution graphs, setup adjustments, rear-end redesign proposals. Engineers shouted across departments. Meetings spawned sub-meetings. Ideas turned into CAD files. Calculations became prototypes. Ferrari was changing. Not in headlines. Not in gossip. But where it matters most, deep within the crucible of engineering and human will. At the heart of the technical war room. In the minds of those who refused to surrender. And leading that transformation wasn't just a driver. It was Lewis Hamilton. And today, his impact wasn't measured by a stopwatch. It was written in red ink, on datasheets, on simulation models, in the renewed fire inside Maranello.